welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm Jen, your host today, and I am joined by the author of a book that is stunningly beautiful and beautifully insightful, and I am so excited and honored to talk about it. So welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Yes, thank you. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Jessica Waite. My book is a memoir called The Widow's Guide to Dead Bastards, and it tells the story of finding out the day after my husband's sudden death that he had been keeping secrets from me, and not the kind of happy secret of like, I've been saving money. No, like the kinds of secrets that I've spent all our money and been hiding dead and a bunch of other things that were really hard. And so the story sort of tracks the discoveries of those things. And then it asks the question, basically, can relationships heal across the veil of death? If you find out these horrible things after someone's died, how can you get some kind of resolution? And how can you, in a lot of ways, if you want to come back to love, like, is that possible? So yeah, that's basically the gist of the story of The Widow's Guide to Dead Bastards. Yeah.
It is absolutely stunning, as I said, and it's incredibly vulnerable and raw, and really an honor to get to sit with you through your process and to see how you deal with these revelations. Before we get too much into that itself, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you came to the book itself, because it does seem like writing itself figured into your recovery process. And I'm wondering if you could sort of talk about how the book evolved.
Yeah, for sure. So, I really do see, and a lot of people say this, like writing as a technology of healing. And one of the things that I was interested in, because widowhood can be financially devastating, is like, how do people, if you don't have a lot of money to put into a bunch of other things, like what are some things that you can do that don't cost anything? And so I have always written in times of distress. My journals paint a very different picture of my life because it's always like, why does everything suck? Or, and that kind of thing. So I've always kind of journaled for catharsis. So definitely the initial parts of writing were just to kind of make sense of what was happening and to interrogate, like who was Sean, my late husband, and what was our life and how could I have not seen some of the things that were going on, all of those kinds of things. But then partly through the process of doing that, and then partly through counseling and that sort of thing, I started to understand it felt like I was the only person that this ever happened to, but that was decidedly not true. Even, I sort of felt like I was being guided toward books in the library, and those books would tell me, no, this has happened to lots of other people and they wrote about it. And so when I realized that I did want to share this story because I felt like there was something in it maybe for other people, then I really worked on the craft of writing. And so I started to take lots of different classes, and I knew this had to be better than my journal. It had, in my mind, it had to be as good as books that, the books that were coming to me. And so I really worked hard to make it something that a reader would want to read. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I do love, obviously I'm biased, but that libraries do factor into your story.
Yeah.
And there is something lovely, I think, about sort of like library serendipity, about how like the books can often come to you at the right time, almost by magic. I really do love
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I'm glad there's a term for it. Library serendipity. I love that so much. Yeah. And so just for someone listening who hasn't read the story yet, it almost seemed as if the books that I needed to find were jumping out at me, like they'd look bigger than the other books, or they'd be clearer than the other books, that sort of thing. And then they'd end up having a direct correlation to what I was going through. So yeah, I'm so happy that happens for other people too.
Yeah. Could we talk a little bit about the structure of the book? I really love the way that it is a series of very short chapters that are almost impressionistic and that take you back and forth through time. And it feels like a sort of very natural reconstruction of how memory works and how processing works. So could you talk about how you structured it and whether it was written in the order it's presented or if pieces were moved around? What was that process like for you?
The approach that I took to writing was sort of like a there's a book called Shimmering Images where you go where the energy is. So the most vivid thing that's in your memory right now is what you write. And so that's sort of what I started with. And I thought that after I'd done that, if I just put those things in chronological order, that would be my first draft. And then, of course, I had a giant weeping session when I realized this is nothing like a first draft. And this is, but basically just, the notes of what will be contained in the story. But I agree, like when you said about the reconstruction, because it's so like what it felt like to me just after Sean died, because he was someone, we were together for 20 years. I really loved him. Our marriage was not in a perfect place, but we had worked through things before, and he was the person that I loved and trusted the most in the world. And so it really felt like after he died and then having these revelations, like my whole life had blown up and every single memory was contaminated with a kind of like, I don't know, nuclear waste, whatever that was toxic to me. And so as I wrote, it was sort of like cleaning off the shards of memory and then putting them back together in a new way. So I think that the short chapters, it does sort of mimic the experience of grief and then reconstructing the story. But I also thoughtful and careful in terms of how I wanted to kind of parcel out the things that I was learning, because the book is structured. The first half, I would say, is the first half takes place in 6 weeks, and it's a very like almost tabloid level scandal. It's very high drama, and then the second half of the book is more about the healing. And so the pace is a lot slower because healing takes time. But I kind of selected some representative things about, just to sort of show the healing journey. And so been getting some reader reviews. And I think the people who really resonate with this story are the ones who maybe have experienced heartbreak or are curious about how that is. How does someone move on? And then the odd person who really doesn't like it. They don't like that shift where the sort of high drama stops and the more reflective part. Yeah, it's because it's definitely there's a change in tone halfway through.
I did really appreciate that because it does, I think, mirror and almost model what your grieving process might look like. I know it does look different for everybody, but there is an arc, that you can maybe sort of expect. And I think
Yeah.
True to that, like in a lot of ways. So.
Yeah. And that's what I was looking at. Like, what is the arc of this? And, in some ways it's a bit of bad news that things always take longer than you wish. Right. And so, I would love to say, here's like if the story was like the 3 easy things I did to get to the other side of this, but no, it's not easy, but it's so worthwhile. So I hope that people will find something for themselves as they read it.
Absolutely. It's a very complicated grief because, you were grieving the loss of a person and the loss of an image of a person, and I imagine that the writing process was very vulnerable and very difficult at times. So I'm just curious, what did self-care look like for you? How did you support yourself through the writing process?
One of the biggest things that was that I found writing community. So it started out taking a giant online course with lots of people, but through that I made some friends, and then we stayed in touch just through the internet. Then I started taking other classes, and so on the writing side, having people to share with, be accountable to, critique, like all of those things was immensely supportive. And then on the digging up things, I did have some counseling. I tried a bunch of different healing modalities just to see what would work with me. And so I found some ways to kind of support my mind and physical body because it took a toll on all of that.
Yeah, I imagine. Did it change the grief process for you, or did you find that it helped you to move through it in certain ways? Like, I'm wondering if the actual writing process sort of evolved how you viewed your experiences.
Absolutely. So, yeah, I think that that's such a great question because I think that the first step is like, almost you're telling the story to yourself, like what happened. I think there's a quote, Andre was the third, like that in memoir, what happened, but you're trying to figure out what the hell happened. And so it's like the first step is like, what the hell happened? And figuring that out. And then once it's out of your mind, it's not like circulating over and over and over and keeping you stuck. And then as you're trying to turn that into something that a reader wants, it helps you kind of connect back into A, that there are other people, B, that these experiences are universal to a large degree. And so that each of those things, it's like turning a corner in like that labyrinth of complicated grief. And so, yeah, the writing and the healing were intertwined for sure.
Wow. Yeah, what I really appreciated too was by discussing the sort of modalities that you tried and your encounters with different support groups and networks and things like that, you do sort of present an array of resources that are available to somebody who might be going through their own grief or their own loss. I really do love the open-mindedness too about, how do you put this? Maybe like blurry lines between like therapeutic, medicinally or medically, and therapeutic in a sort of spiritual way. Could you talk a little bit about that? How you use, the tools of medicine and the tools of a deeper sort of sanctity almost.
Yeah, I would love to talk about that because I grew up outside of any church. My parents were different religions, and so they didn't come together. So I grew up with a sort of secular, rational, materialist worldview. And there's a lot in the culture that supports that. And you can go a long way with that. But these existential moments, and when there's some kind of question like what happens when we die, rational materialism fails a little bit. And with the things that were happening in my experience, I couldn't explain them using the old way that I used to think about things. And so I had to find some new way. And I was very rigorous in my sense making, trying to find plausible explanations through science. I listened to tons of scientists, physicians, and eventually what helped me the most was working with a death doula who sort of held my own belief system and then also helped to integrate, like if we opened up to a different kind of thinking that could include what's happening, then maybe, and then that really just helped me process and move forward. Because yeah, and the way that I told the story, I hope it was never intended to persuade anyone or to like steer them away from anything that they believe or hold to be true. It's just more watching one person share their experience, bash around, make mistakes, and then find a path through. So yeah.
Yeah, it's really lovely, I think, in that it withholds judgment from both the techniques and from people who believe in them and who don't. Is you self-narrate. And so you are presenting your own experiences without that sort of judgment around that, I think, and really
Yeah, yeah. Or like I have judgment and then I'm a little bit like, so sometimes I'm humbled. Yeah.
It's true. Yeah, I
Yeah.
guess it is because you narrate your judgments in the moment as well too, but you're also
Yeah.
holding judgment for yourself in those moments, and that I think that's really important as well.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
A point that I really appreciated is something that you say about how trauma can be relational, but a lot of our traditional recourses tend to be individual. You narrate a lot of sort of communities and networks and opportunities for connection that sort of emerged from your loss. And I'm very curious about that because I think my generation loves to sort of like joke about trauma bonding, as though it is a good thing. And it
Yeah,
can be,
yeah.
but not necessarily. So can you talk about that, about the opportunities for connection that emerged?
Yeah, I think that was the biggest learning for me was just having been raised in a culture and then the microculture, of my family's place and time about just that like hyper individualistic, like it's like being independent is the number one best and biggest thing that you can be. Like I couldn't have gone on. Do you know what I mean? So if I had to deal with this all myself, I would still be curled up in a ball. And so I think my biggest learning is that we heal in community. And so the only way out is with a little bit of modeling assistance, encouragement from other people. And it's hard to reach out when grief can be so isolating, and shame is a double down on that. And so I had very good editorial support with my publisher. But the one bit of pushback that I gave was when I saw that the story was being shaped into like more of a hero's journey, like a personal growth story. And I don't see it that way. I see this as a relational growth story. Yes, it's great if I get better and move on, but also I wanted there to be an idea of a redemption arc for my late husband and for our relationship and for our family unit. So though in the bigger picture that, unless everyone gets better, it doesn't like really matter if only one party does.
Yeah, that is another aspect of the book that I found to be really resonant for me about forgiveness, or even not even forgiveness necessarily, but coming to terms with betrayal when that person is not there for you to work through it with. And there is something really lovely, I think, about Yes, the way that a community can support you through that. I sort of lost the train of that question a little bit. I apologize.
No, but I love that, like, sort of where you went, because my personal belief is that no one ever has to forgive anyone. Do you know what I mean? It's like that there's no obligation to ever forgive, but there is a kind of liberation in coming to terms where it's just like there is some truth here. It's very difficult to face. It's going to require each of us to step up and revise our mental model of who this person was, who we are. And those things are hard and challenging, but extremely liberating and extremely, I don't know, it brings peace. You brought peace to my heart when I was able to come to those terms. And I think forgiveness is in some ways the best word we have, but it's not the exact word. Coming to terms, or just coming to some kind of understanding is more apt. Yeah.
Yeah, almost, I guess, like acceptance in a mindfulness way, because I think a lot of people think forgiveness implies, and it's okay. And I'm okay.
Yeah, that you're excusing something,
Yeah.
or that you're like, yeah, ready to sign me up for more of that. Yeah. No, thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
And it really, like, you deal with the sort of complicated nature of that and all of the paradoxes that sort of come with it when you're feeling so many opposite things at the same time. Like, it's really, I think, a very thoughtful narration that can be helpful for a lot of people who do think they're going through something that has happened only to them. And, even if nobody is really going through the same exact thing as anybody else, I think there is such comfort in that camaraderie of, at least there are people who've experienced similar things. And
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
there's another line that I really loved where you talk about therapy as being like setting a bone rather than being about something that you emerge feeling healed or better from, even in the moment. And I think another thing that you demonstrate really well is that healing does take faith. And not the sort of, necessarily spiritual faith, but just sort of like a belief in yourself and in your situation that you will get through it in the long term, even if you don't feel better in the moment. So yeah, could you talk a little bit about taking that long view of recovery, perhaps, and sort of how that feeds into the book too?
Yeah, 100%. And so one of my best friends, several months before Sean died, she was hit by a bus and critically injured and partially paralyzed. Her spine was broken, her pelvis was broken in three places. And it happened that she was traveling back and forth between where she lives and where I live, which is where her neurosurgery and everything took place. And so I got to sit in on her appointments and listen to what her neurologist was telling her, listen to what her physios were telling her, and then also see her determination. Like, she has one of the most strongest senses of self-confidence and self-belief, and that faith that she would get better. She was modeling that for me. And that, I think, helped me so much. And just hearing them say, like, this is going to take years and you need to visualize things, and you need to, like, one of the things was about keeping the receptors alive so that when her nerve would regrow, it could reattach. And I'm like, there's a whole thing about keeping that part of you alive so that when you heal, you'll be okay. And so I'm so grateful to her name's Catherine, for modeling that for me and just giving me that determination to keep going and know that it was going to get better. And that's the other thing. If someone's listening right now in the agony of the immediacy of a horrifying thing in their life, that's a totalizing feeling, but it gets better almost immediately, where there are moments that get better, and then there's longer stretches that get better. And so it's just so important to notice when those little bits of joy happen, when that little bits of laughter are there, to say those are breadcrumbs for the future.
Yes. And I do wonder sort of what role being a writer or being of a writerly persuasion shaped that experience for you. Because I do feel like part of writing is looking, right? And experiencing
Yes.
the world, and then sort of being able to see it in a way such that it creates things for you to write about and explore. So yeah, that's really lovely.
Yeah, and paying attention, it just, that way of noticing. And so that, to me, would be the thing that I hope people take away from this story the most, is like, pay attention to your own life, to your own intuition, to if some wonderful synchronicity happens, pay attention to that. If you're getting a feeling something's wrong in your relationship, pay attention to that. Like, there's just so much that's out there if we can tune into it to help us take the next right action.
That's really lovely. And I think that's a really lovely note for our listeners to go out on. So thank you so much for sharing this book with us. Are you writing anything else at the moment, or what's on your horizon?
Right now, I'm taking it as it comes. I have a couple of ideas, but nothing that's too ready to announce. But thank you so much for having me, and it's been just a joy to be here.
Oh, thank you. Okay, listeners, it's now your turn. Please go check out The Widow's Guide to Dead Bastards. It is an absolutely beautiful book, and I think you will get so much out of it. By the time that you are listening to this episode, it will be out in the world. So please go to your favorite independent bookstore or library. Those are around too. All right, thank you so much. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.